verliefd en verryp. Ek smoeg vir die bad news, vir Zuma en sy views, van ons op TV moet kyk. Ek wil nie meer hoor hoe ons tieners begrawe, oor niemand hul steur aan die wet. Ek wil nie meer lees van affirmative action, of beklei om te hou wat ek het. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gein, 'n koos toe plesie en 'n tellery, wat liedjies sing en skryf en stry, oor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly.
Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. I'm very pleased to announce that tonight we have with us once more my friend Schalk van der Merwe from South Africa, awake and ready to talk to you at 2 o'clock in the morning their time. And we're going to bring you part 2 of our overview of South African history. Good evening, Schalk, and welcome back on the show.
Good evening, Karen, and very nice to be back with you.
Thank you so much, Schalk. I just feel so bad when I think of me sitting here with the sun going down and you having to stay awake all night and still be ready and full of information for us. But tonight, Schalk, I think we kind of got up to around 1948 last time. And I think that that would be a really good place to start, because it is a very important date in the Afrikaner history of South Africa.
Yes, Karen, indeed. 1948 marks the Afrikaners coming to power through the Nationalist Party, and it's also a benchmark from where apartheid, the so-called system of apartheid, was implemented more formally in South Africa. So I think what I need to do is just to give the listener a little bit of background once again, to recap what we spoke about last time, and then we can move on from there if you don't mind.
No, absolutely, Schalk. I'm relying on you for this, because I know the facts, but you give it much more context than I can.
Thank you very much, Karen. Yes, if you look at the whole history up to 1948 in South Africa, you saw the founding of South Africa by the Dutch people, the spread of the people into South Africa, the Great Trek, the Boer Wars, the industrialization of South Africa, the mining industry that started to bloom in South Africa. But you also see the history of where different races and different peoples always were in clashes with one another, because it's a very multicultural type of situation in South Africa. You have all different types of white people in South Africa, English speaking, Dutch speaking, Afrikaans speaking, later on even Greek people, Portuguese people, and that only encompasses the white population. Then you have the black population who exists from various tribes and groups. You had colored people, you had Khoisan people who were the original people living in Southern Africa. So you had this whole blend of racial and cultural mixing in South Africa for centuries that led up to 1948, and the Afrikaners once again taking over South Africa. Looking at apartheid as a system. Now, the word apartheid, unfortunately, there's so much negativity connected to it. The connotations are so negative. At the moment that you say the word, usually people put it into a box and they say it's all bad.
Yes.
Whereas anything else is all good. But we must remember that apartheid, that what was later on called apartheid, was actually a system that evolved in South Africa over centuries. And it was not only in South Africa, it was basically in the whole colonial empire, the whole colonial world, if you want to, of whether the European nations colonized. Not only even in South Africa or Africa, worldwide, where you had segregation of different races and color bars in the workplace, etc. So those things are not only South African, but South Africa, unfortunately, and the Afrikaner people have to carry this burden of apartheid or segregation because of the image that the media created around it.
I absolutely agree with you, because apartheid literally means a separateness. And it was exactly the same thing as segregation, but somehow it has become apart hate. And as you say, the minute you mention that word, there's so much hatred and oppression and conceived murders and things connected with it that are mostly not true, that the word itself has become it means hatred and oppression and murder. It's really not it's become an awful word, where segregation never had those connotations attached to it.
Exactly, Karen. And I think, especially in North America and the United States in particular, the reason why people have this extremely negative view of what happened in South Africa under apartheid or separate development, the actual term was separate development, uh, is because of the segregationist laws in the United States itself. You also had a color separation of Negroes and whites. And even discrimination against the original people of the North America, the so-called American Indians, the Aborigines there. So it's unfortunately that people blend those two things into one to try to create for themselves what happened in South Africa, where it's not the truth. Uh, the United States, you had slavery in the South, and after the Civil War in 1865, with the abolition of slavery, it became an underclass. The black people, the Negroes, became an underclass in the United States, and for nearly a century, they were regarded as these subhumans, as the offspring of slaves, and all those things. And then the liberation movements in North America, the Black consciousness movements came to a fore, and basically liberated the black people in North America. And it's in that same context, the same time period, that apartheid was starting to bloom in South Africa. And I think that is what imprinted into the mind of especially the American people a totally wrong image of what apartheid or separate development was, because they saw their own history in what was happening in South Africa across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's my opinion of why we had all the extreme negativity surrounding the system of apartheid.
Well, also, Schalk, don't you think that, and I'm not speaking against America, but I do kind of feel that they patted themselves on the back because they'd brought an end to slavery and done a really good, humane thing. And then they looked across the ocean and saw that although we didn't have slavery at that time, we were still doing the segregation thing. And they were not... it was easier to say, well, we did the good thing in the 60s when we had the human rights marches and whatever. But South Africa is not good because they're perpetuating this thing that we brought a stop to. So it was kind of a pat on the back for themselves and deflecting the badness of the system onto us, rather. In a way.
Yes, no, that's exactly what my point of view is about this. Also in Europe, many years ago, I met a person that lived in Northampton in England, and the only black person that he knew was basically a black doctor that had practice in Northampton. So what he thought a black person was reflected in that one person, which was, by all accounts, from what he told, a very good person. And then he came to South Africa with the idea of this is how all black people are, which is, of course, a totally false idea. I mean, there's no correlation between the two. And he he became one of the greatest racists that I ever saw when he started to realize that the glorified image that he had, you called it in your introduction, the noble savage.
Yes.
That simply doesn't exist. It's not real. It doesn't exist. And he turned that person in his own personal capacity. He turned him around. But I think that's the problem that we always faced. was this wrong idea that the outside world had of what South Africa was, and the different races here, the whole mixture, everything. It was portrayed in such a skewed way to the outside world that unfortunately the narrative is so strong now that we have to fight that even before we can get to the truth of the whole matter.
Yes, absolutely. And Schalk, people, I was talking to my husband the other day, and as you know, he's an American born and bred, about it. And he said, until he came to South Africa himself, he had no idea about the savages. None. Hollywood and the media and other ways have portrayed them as really, as I called it, the noble savages. That is how they are portrayed. He had no idea of the underlying lack of civilization and violence that is prevalent in the black tribes. He had no idea of it. And so
yes,
it's a very hard thing, because people look across the sea to South Africa and say, well, why to this day do we not just live in peace with these black people? But they don't understand that in their natural environment, they are not peaceful people.
Yes, that's I understand what you're saying. I don't want to dwell too far back now in history. We already spoke about that. But for instance, the creation of the Zulu nation in the 1820s in South Africa, it was an extremely violent and it was turmoil in which the Zulu nation was born and created, where the King Shaka, very well known maybe to American listeners, Shaka Zulu, he literally destroyed everything and everybody that he couldn't rule or bring into the fold of the Zulu nation. And that caused what was called later on the Defikani and the Mefikani, which was this great, huge, tumultuous event of black tribes moving all across and even becoming cannibals and eating one another, and very bad things happening there. So the idea of this peaceful land where people of a certain race, black people here, were living, and then all of a sudden the white colonists came and they took the land away, and it was a violent setup because of the white settlers. That is simply not true. It is not what happened. But let's move on from that. I want to highlight something to the American listeners, a fact that's overlooked, unfortunately. And it goes about where the system of segregation in South Africa came from. Now, the general perception is that it's an Afrikaner thing, and it was a nationalist party thing as from 1948. But it's simply also not the truth, for the very simple reason that as of 1948, there was a formalization of existing laws and regulations, just simply into more codified laws, and even granting more rights back to the black population that came from the British colonial empire. It was not Afrikaner invention, it was British colonial empire that in the first place brought the segregation into South Africa. So I wanted to start by explaining to you, we spoke about slavery. As early as 1833, already there was the Slavery Abolition Act that was enacted in the United Kingdom. Now, at that stage, most of South Africa was under British rule. You must remember that we didn't have the Great Trek yet, so it was basically the Cape Colony that stretched from Cape Town, today's Cape Town, all the way to the Fish River in the Eastern Cape. So the British colony, because of the abolition of Slavery Act in 1833, all slavery was abolished all over the empire, the British Empire. So 30 years before the Americans, the British abolished slavery. So that started the more formalized type of segregation, because now you didn't have slavery anymore, but you would rather have segregation in South Africa between races. But you must remember something now. In the British colony of the Cape, there wasn't a huge number of black people. There were people from European descent, mostly German, Dutch, and French, who made up the Afrikaners, the so-called Boer people. And then, of course, the English people. 1820, they had a whole group of settlers in the Eastern Cape and so forth. The people that were segregated from a white population of the Cape Colony were mostly what was later called colored people, Kleerlinge.
Yes.
And it's a mixed race of Khoisan people, the original people living in the Cape. It's a yellow. The color, the skin color is more yellow. It's also a shorter race. Their physical shortness or the length of the people. So it's not the black Bantu people that you find in most of sub-Saharan Africa. The mixed race, the colored people came from them, then also of slaves that were imported from the east, the old Dutch East India colonies. So they made up the colored people in the Cape. So basically segregation.
Were those the Cape slaves? Were those slaves or were those not slaves?
Yes, under the Dutch colonial authorities, you must remember that the Dutch ruled the Cape for many years, more than a century. For instance, about 160 years. During that time, you had a huge import of slaves from the Far East, from Indonesia and Malaysia and those areas. So the slaves coming to South Africa were not black slaves. It were people mostly of East Indian descent. Once again, it's totally different from the Americas, where you had slaves from West Africa, black slaves being brought in to work on the plantations in the Caribbean and later on in the mainland of North America. So, as I say, the segregation laws in the Cape Colony was basically between the colored people brought in by the Dutch and intermarrying with the Khoisan people on the one hand and the white population on the other. So it's not segregation between white and black as much. But that was then in the latter part of the 19th century. Then in the very close to the same time of the Boer War, you saw that the whole British colonial empire started to move to a direction where British viceroys and a British ruling class started to evolve. In India, for instance, their whole ruling class were basically white English speaking people. Exactly the same was happening in South Africa at that stage with the local political scene. So in the Cape Colony, for instance, you had Cecil John Rhodes and the very powerful British mining moguls starting to take over the British control or the control over politics in the southern in South Africa. And that caused many of the more segregationist laws to start to be enacted, because I think the British realized that they will have to control South Africa for a century to come. And they couldn't really do it by having inclusive government of all the races and all the people in South Africa. So, for instance, in 1892, you had the Franchise and Ballot Act enacted in the Cape Colony. Which basically took away black voting rights. Those black people already living in the old Cape Colony, because of a legislation that came through in 1892. Now that precedes the Nationalist Party taking over by 50 years. Already at that point, you had the disenfranchising of black people by the British government. Cecil John Rhodes himself. Now you will be very well aware of the Rhodes Must Fall protest action that took place recently in South Africa and even in Britain.
Yes,
they are quite right to hate Cecil John Rhodes, because Cecil John Rhodes didn't have much time for the black populace in South Africa. You will see, especially under his rule and later on in the Rhodesia, how he brought in the whole British colonial system of white British colonial rule and creating a ruling class of British administrators. So even Cecil John Rhodes, who is seen as one of the great enemies of the Boer and the Afrikaner people in earlier years, he's one of those people that pushed for the whole system of segregation and white rule to be embedded into South African society.
And then came 1913 with the Land Act, etc. Was that the first time we had such an act?
I want to sketch what happened there. Um, you must remember that in 1899, the Second Boer War started, the Anglo-Boer War, and then 3 years later, 1902, the Boers and the British made a peace. And by 1910, the Union of South Africa was created. And it was created by the four old states in South Africa, being the Cape Colony and Natal, those being British colonies, and the two old Boer republics of Transvaal and the Free State. They were bound together into what was called the Union of South Africa. Now, the Union of South Africa, you must remember something. This was what was called the old white South Africa. So you had a lot of tribal areas lying in these areas that were not formally now part of this union of the white states, the white nations. So the British colonial authorities had to do something about the black tribal areas, and that caused in 1913 the 1913 Land Act, where they simply went and they demarcated the areas that already were black areas, and they basically barred white people from owning land there, but the reverse is also true. They also barred black people from owning land in the white areas. Once again, not Afrikaners. These were British colonial authorities, and it was under British rule that these laws were enacted.
So essentially what they did there, Schalk, was they took already demarcated black areas, but they made it they legalized it. They wrote it into legislation at that time, so that that was it.
Yes, it was basically not to take land away from the black tribes, but it was actually to protect the black tribes still living in the tribal areas. You must remember when the Boer republics, for instance, came to being. You had the white areas where the Boer people lived, but then you had the numerous black areas where the different black tribes lived with their own kingships, their own chieftainships. They lived there in peace. You will find in the history of the Boer republics, for instance, in the Free State, you didn't even have these black tribal lands. All the Basotho people were living in what is today called Lesotho, in the olden days Basotho land. They were living in their own kingdom. So in the Free State, you didn't even have this setup. Further to the north, in the Transvaal, the old Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek, in those areas, you had certain demarcated areas where tribes lived. It was their land, and it was only their land. And the tribal chiefs, it belonged to them, not even to the common black people. And it was basically those areas, and also in Natal and the Eastern Cape. It's basically those areas where the tribes already lived. It was tribal areas that were simply formalized by the 1913 Land Act. So once again, this narrative has been built that the 1913 Land Act took a lot of land away from black people and gave it to white people, which is simply not the truth. The opposite is true. It stopped white people from gaining even more land from the black people by sale or trade or whatever.
And I think it was you, Schalk, who said if you superimpose the rainfall area map over the tribal lands maps, you will see that, for instance, Zululand, which is Zululand to this day and ruled over by a Zulu king and his chieftains, yes. But that is quite possibly the most fertile, productive area in the whole of South Africa.
It is. You must remember something. When the black tribes started to move into South Africa, it's very difficult to say. Some scholars would say around the 15th century. Some would say around the 18th century. But the long and the short is when the black tribes started to move into what is today called South Africa, they moved to a certain point for two reasons. The first reason simply being that they met the white colonists moving north. So that was the first thing that blocked them from moving south, which makes a fallacy of this whole thing of black people or white people stealing land from black people. But the second one was also rainfall, because you must remember that the black tribes were pastoral. They had cattle and goats, and these animals had to feed on something. And South Africa, the western part of South Africa is very dry and arid, and cold. The eastern part is more wet and warm. It's more tropic. So you found that the black tribe settled mostly in that area, the eastern half and the northern half of South Africa. And that, of course, is the more fertile land. To the west, you have the great areas of the Makwa land and the Karoo and the mountainous areas of the Western Cape, which is not very suited for farming. The rainfall is low, as I said already. Whereas the eastern part, the northern part, it's subtropical, it's humid. Plants grow in abundance there. You have the best farming land there, the best rivers, the rivers running out of the whole Maluti and Drakensberg area. So that's the best part of South Africa. And that is where these black tribes settled. And that is where they were demarcated as of 1913. And I'm very glad you bring this up, Karen, because once again, the narrative says that black people were ordered into these little small reservations all over the place in the middle of the desert, and they died in their thousands. It is literally not the truth. That never happened. It's once again superimposing this American view of what happened to the Indians during the era of reservations, as of the middle of the 19th century, where the remnants of the Great Plains Indians were put into these little conservation areas and reservations. That never happened in South Africa. It is simply not the actual facts of the whole thing there.
But also, Schalk, I think it's very important how we started out, that the noble savage is more savage than noble. It needs to be understood that these tribes naturally war with each other. So,
yes.
So they naturally segregated themselves. The Brits then wrote it into law, but in a large part, it was natural segregation, because left to their own, they fight with each other. They do not like each other.
Yes, that's a fact. As I already pointed out, when the Zulu nation was created in the northern parts of Natal, they made war with anybody and everybody around them. So much so that it caused a huge migration pattern into the rest of South Africa. I would speculate and say that if the Zulu nation never came into being, where the Voortrekkers later on moved in, they would not have even encountered any black tribes. The people that the Voortrekkers encountered were those fleeing from the Zulu people in Natal. You will remember the Matibele tribe of Mzilikazi. He was a Zulu chieftain himself. And because of his bad relations with Shaka Zulu, he started to flee into the interior of South Africa, and then he met up with the Voortrekkers. So he wouldn't have been there if it was not for the war and the genocide that was taking place east of the Drakensberg. So that's what you're saying is quite true. The black tribes were always in a constant war with one another. It was not a peaceful situation, a peaceful scenario where these different little tribes would live and nothing happened, and they only looked after their cattle and they were happy. It was the typical scenario of different small little tribes warring constantly with one another and segregating into smaller groups and chieftainships and so forth.
Yes, because was it? I'm not sure whether it was Dingon or Shaka when his mother died. How many people were killed then because they didn't cry loudly enough for the death of his mother?
Yes.
I'm not sure which one it was.
It was Shaka. It was when Queen Nandi died. He actually went so far that the British missionaries that lived with the Zulu people, they described it that there were as many as 20,000 women killed because they didn't cry enough. That was the nature of the civilization or the under-civilization that you were dealing with here. once again, when the Dutch landed in the Cape, at that point, black people did not even move into the interior of South Africa up to the point of the Fish River. The first time that there was contact between the black tribes moving from north was about the mid of the 1700s, 1750, 1760, approximately there. And at that stage, you didn't have different nations. You had small family groups and tribes, if you want to call them clans, relating, or maybe the same as you would have in the Highlands of Scotland. Small little tribes. You didn't have a Zulu nation. You didn't have a Xhosa nation. You didn't have a Sotho nation. It was basically small little groups living all over the place with their own kings and their own chieftains. It was only in the 1800s, as of the 1820s, with the formation of the Zulu tribe, that for the first time you had real nations being formed in South Africa amongst the black people.
Yes.
The Sotho people, the Basotho people, the people now living in Lesotho and then mostly in the Free State province of South Africa, those people were the scattered remnants of many of the black tribes that fled out of Natal. They didn't live there in the first place. Why they went to live in Basotho land was the mountainous Drakensberg area. They basically fled into the mountains, and their great chief, Moswes, he basically united all the small little remnant groups in the mountains, and they became the Sotho nation. And that was only about in the 1840s. Now remember, the Dutch landed in the Cape 200 years before that. So,
yes.
So there were Afrikaners in South Africa 200 years before they were Sotho people.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're back to 1913 when they formed the Union of South Africa. So what they did was they wrote into law each person's area, basically.
Yes,
so the Zulus
yes.
had Zulu land, and the Sothos had Sotho land, and so on and so forth, and the Vendors had Vender land, and etc. So they wrote that in because they were now amalgamating all these regions into one, yes?
Basically, what happened was that the British colonial system needed the king or queen of England to basically become the queen of the different colonial areas. So you found something very strange in happening in South Africa. Those areas, the black areas, the tribal areas, taken over by the British. The queen in England, the king or the queen, she actually became the ruler of the black areas. You will remember the protectorate over Basotho land, the protectorate
Yes.
over Bechuana land, which is today Botswana, the protectorate over Swaziland. The British royalty became the royalty of that area. Once again, this is not new. This is exactly what happened, for instance, in India, where the Queen of England was also the Empress of India.
Yes.
It's exactly the same system. Exactly the same system. So you found that the British Crown itself became the protectors of these black areas in South Africa. Now, this of course contradicts the whole narrative of where black people are being exploited. The opposite is happening. They are now being protected by the Crown. So it's totally the opposite of the narrative. Right. You must remember that we're not only dealing with the 1913 Land Act. You will also see in the Union of South Africa a host of other legislation that came through. For instance, in the Natives in Urban Areas Bill of 1918, that was the precursor of the Group Areas Act of many years later, and that basically regulated the black people and the colored people inside the white areas to where they may live. So that even came from 1918, not 1948 and later, through the natives in urban areas. Then you had, for instance, also the Native Administration Act, and that specifically made the paramount chiefs, the chieftains of the different black tribes, made them subjects of the British Crown. By administration of law, they became literally the British citizens through the Crown of Britain. And these are things that people simply don't understand. They don't understand why things happen in South Africa. These are the underlying factors that caused in 1948 the Nationalist Party to overturn the whole system. And in 1961, when the Republic came, changed it even further. It was more to counteract the British Crown, as it was ever the zwart gevaar that's held as the reason for apartheid.
Yes.
I can also explain to you the Asians, the Indian people and the colored people. Now, the Indian people living in South Africa, of course, they are not native to South Africa. They were brought in by the British colonial power during the latter part of the 19th century, as of 1850 and onwards. They were brought in to work in the sugarcane lands in Natal and the factories, etc. So they were not native to South Africa, but they were brought in huge numbers, so much so that when they were not needed as labor anymore by the British colonial authorities, they simply ended up with a problem of what do we do with the Indians in Natal now? And they gained citizenship there, and they lived there as South Africans, whereas they had no relationship to the land in any way. They were brought in as not even slave laborers, as contract workers by the British authorities. The same with the very early Chinese people who worked in the mines in Transvaal. They came in as workers there. So you had another component in the racial mix now being introduced into South Africa. The original colored people, yes, Karen?
Was it a British rule that the Indians had to stay in Natal? They were not allowed really to go to the Transvaal, for instance.
Yeah, up to I would think at least the 1960s, more than a century later, an Indian people could not even travel through the Free State.
Yes.
Could not travel through the Free State. If an Indian person was found traveling, he would have been arrested and simply extradited back to Natal.
Yes.
And of course, they were also brought in the Transvaal province, Old Transvaal Republic, to physically settle there because they were British subjects. They never had anything to do with the Boer Republic. They were British subjects. Coming back to the colored people, the colored people also a minority people today in South Africa, but the colored people, as I explained previously, the Khoisan and the Malay slaves, the race that came from those people, they were living mostly in the Cape Colony, and they were also being disenfranchised systematically by the British system. As I explained, because I think Rhodes tried to superimpose this colonial type of rule into South Africa, as you found in the rest of the British colonial empire. So they were also systematically, they were losing their rights, they couldn't vote anymore, etc. So it's a whole movement into the direction of disenfranchising of anybody that did not adhere to the British colonial system. Of course, they couldn't discount the Boers, because the Boers fought for their freedom. They couldn't take the voting right away from the Boers. I would speculate to say that if 1910, with the unification, the Boers were in a weaker position that they would also have been disenfranchised. I have no doubts about that. So that in the end, you basically had, like the Indian system, only the British running the country.
Yes.
But of course, the Afrikaners, the Boer people, were very strong. They were boisterous. Maybe the British feared that they would stand up again, which actually happened in 1914. And that is why they were not excluded from voting in South Africa. So these things all happened around the unification and the early years after that. For instance, the Native Land Act Trust, Native Land and Trust Act of 1936 was even one of the latest ones, where they started to hold in trust areas to enlarge the existing 1913 areas. And those trust areas were held as trust to the Crown, to the British Crown, not the South African government, not the Union government, to the British Crown. So once again, it's the perpetuation of the British colonial system. Okay, of course, now on the other side, the white side of the history of South Africa, in the 1930s, you had this huge rise in Afrikaner nationalism. And then by 1948, the Nationalist Party of the Afrikaners took over the Union government. Remember, South Africa is now still under the Queen. It's still a British colonial part of the British Empire, the colonial empire, but it's a separate government on its own, the Union government. That government is taken over democratically by voting in the Nationalist Party of Dr. D.F. Malan. So that is in 1948, where the Afrikaner people actually took back the country or the government of the Union of South Africa from British colonial rule. And that marks the start of the rule of the Nationalist Party, which became this big black hole in the South African history and always connected to the negativity of apartheid.
Yes. But I think, yes, you've done a really good job there, Schalk, because I think it's very important for people to understand that, A, it was the normal thing around the world in those days. Where a country was colonized, there was segregation. It was accepted as normal. There was nothing strange or nothing about it. It was the normal way of life in those days. And B, that it was an inherited system that the Afrikaners, when they won the popular vote in 1948, they inherited this system.
Yes. At one stage, I wrote an article about what could the Afrikaners have done in 1948. Now, one of the scenarios was to simply disband the whole British colonial segregation system. That's theoretically, the Nationalist Party could have said, okay, we passed the British colonial system now. Everybody can vote. Everybody is enfranchised. Everybody is equal. But what kind of upheaval would that have caused in 1948? It's impossible to imagine. It would have meant the end, basically, of civilization in South Africa, and not even only South Africa, in the whole of the Southern African subcontinent. So, what could the Afrikaners do? They now, after 40 years that they haven't had power in South Africa, all of a sudden they have the power in South Africa. They're sitting with this system of segregation of races, of an economy that's built on classes and races from bottom up. So what can they do now? They must utilize this. They can't simply now go like the Russians did at one stage and abolish serfdom. And all of a sudden, everybody is now free and equal. And it's impossible in South Africa to do that.
Because you have in any case, Schalk, because we were still ruled by the Queen. We may have won the popular vote,
yes,
but we were still under British rule.
Exactly, Karen. We were still part of the British Empire, so we had to adhere to the South Africa Act of 1910. We had to adhere to British colonial policy surrounding these things. So we couldn't do much more than simply take this system and utilize it and formalize it. You know, the Afrikaner people, we always have this thing. We call it the Boermakeplan.
Yes.
So you're sitting with this bad situation, and now you make a plan with it. You turn it into production and you make it work. And that is basically what happened as of 1948. The Afrikaner government simply took this poorly designed social engineering of the British, and they formalized it into a system where it actually worked. And South Africa started to grow tremendously economically, which benefited everybody, not only the white population, everybody. And that is what happened after 1948. So you had a lot of legislation coming through Nationalist Party government that now seemed as if the nationalists are creating a system of apartheid or segregation. But it's not. It's just simply formalizing what was already in place and expounding on that.
Yes. But I think, Schalk, what we also need to say is that even then, the whites were never a majority.
Yes. Now, you must remember something. The white population in the white part of the old South Africa were also a minority, because through the British colonial economic system, you had migrant laborers coming from the tribal areas and working in the factories and the mines in the white areas. And they were many more in number than the white people. And that's why even under the British colonial rule, you had the color bar legislation that said that the black population or the black migrant workers can do certain work in the mines and the factories, whereas the white people would do other work, managerial work, etc. But systematically, you had this influx of the black tribes into the traditional white areas for economic reasons, not political reasons or social reasons, simply coming there to work in the factories and the businesses and the mines created by the white population. So the white people indeed were always a small minority in the whole context, the whole racial context and mix up of the South African population in whole. So that's the truth. So something had to be done to safeguard the white population, the European, it was at that stage still called the European population in South Africa, to safeguard their future. And that was also one of the things on which the Nationalist Party actually won the 1948 elections, by saying the white man also has a future in South Africa. We're going to enact and create a system where the white person will be safe and his children and his children's children will still have a place to live in South Africa, because the Afrikaner people has nowhere to go. We can't go back to Europe. We've been in Africa for hundreds of years. I have a Dutch surname, but I'm not a Dutchman. There's no way that we can return. So what do? We must stay here, and we must make a plan to fit into the whole scenario. So that's very true. We were always a minority in South Africa. I want to point out to you the different pieces of legislation that came through. There was, for instance, the much maligned Population Registration Act, under which the racial classification took place. Now, on a personal level, I can understand that this law was quite invasive in people's lives, because especially for the colored community, through intermarriage, there was also a lot of white blood in that, or white genetics into that racial group. And sometimes you had families, one person in a family being classified a colored person and another person in that family being classified as white. So I can understand that on a purely personal level, legislation like this was extremely invasive. And that caused an outcry from the ordinary people. One can understand that. You had, for instance, the act about public amenities, which segregated white toilets and black toilets, for instance, which was always this big thing, and everybody was always complaining about it. So I can understand that on a purely personal level, the petty apartheid laws would have caused a lot of disruption in people's lives, and it definitely would have made people feel bad about themselves because of their race. I understand that, but if you look at the greater scope of things, the grand apartheid scheme of the Nationalist Party, it starts to make sense that everybody is allowed to develop separately, and that was basically what all these legislations and acts tried to establish, that everybody has its own, and they can develop as a separate people, as a separate race, as a separate cultural group. It created that space for them. So on the one hand, you have this personal thing that I can understand fully. But then you must also look at the whole consequence of this and the huge, tremendous growth that took place in South Africa during the time of the apartheid regime. So when you weigh these two things up, you must try to see the context, and you must try to see that it was not all bad. It was not this evil system of killing huge numbers of people and enslaving people and these things. They were good, but they were also bad, and one has to recognize both of those elements.
Yes, absolutely, Schalk, because the picture that the world has is that it was all bad. But I think you've very, very neatly put it in. It was kind of a self-defense mechanism for the whites, but it was not intended particularly as a bad or repressive thing for the blacks.
No, no, definitely not. If you look at later legislation, for instance, the Bantu Authorities Act, it went even further to take these areas of the 1913 Land Act that was enlarged in 1936, and it made those areas proper entities that could govern themselves. Some of these states even later on gained their independence. So, in other words, it's the idea of apartheid creating slavery is exactly the opposite of what apartheid was trying to create. Apartheid was trying to create a multi-nation South Africa where everybody could govern themselves. So you had these tribal areas now becoming formalized homelands with their
Yes.
own governments, not even only chieftains, proper governments that was developed by the nationalist government. An area like Botswana became an independent nation. They had their own president, the last one being Lucas Mangope. They had their own government, Ciskei, Transkei. KwaZulu-Natal, today's KwaZulu-Natal, the KwaZulu area, was basically an independent nation on its own, who could govern on its own. So it's definitely not an enslaving system. It's actually a liberating system, where the
But
British tried to enforce their crown and their rule onto it. The Nationalist Party came and do the opposite. They would rather than give the self-determination back to the black population and the black tribes to rule themselves, to have their own state and their own country.
But Schalk, we also did not just leave them to an uncivilized way of life. We built them schools, universities, hospitals, airstrips, supplied electricity, clean water, etc.
Yes, that's a fact, Khan. You must remember that the whole apartheid system was built on the tax being collected from mostly white people and white business.
The minority.
Yes, the minority. It has always been that. It still is. It still is. It hasn't really changed under the new South Africa.
Yes.
So white capital built the black states. And not only the black states, it also built the black communities in the white areas. For instance, a township like Soweto, I always point out Soweto as the best example.
Yes.
Soweto is simply an acronym for Southwestern Townships.
Yep.
Now, before apartheid, there wasn't something like Soweto. The apartheid government came and they developed a whole city to house the black people living in the southern part of Transvaal, which is now called Gauteng. They developed a whole city for the black people. Now, on whose money was that done? Of course, the white taxpayers' money. But it's not this system, this narrative of white people taking away from black people. This is white people giving to black people so that they could be raised to the level of the European living in South Africa. Schooling, the whole schooling system, of course, the homelands had their own schooling system, which was actually very good. You must remember something. Take Nelson Mandela as an example. Nelson Mandela was a qualified lawyer.
Yes.
Now, if the education system under apartheid was so harsh and so bad against black people, how is it possible for a person to qualify himself as a lawyer, a qualified lawyer, and practices law? He practiced law in Johannesburg under this brutal system of exploitation.
Did
How is that
Gandhi
possible?
not also become a lawyer in South Africa?
Yes, Gandhi was a lawyer. He was an Indian lawyer in Natal before he went to India to liberate India there. He was a lawyer.
Yes.
I can point out numerous examples of people in South Africa, black people specifically, that were highly educated. Robert Sobukwe was highly educated. Juf Lutuli was highly educated inside this apartheid or colonialist system. So the argument that it's this repressive system of exploitation against black people is simply smacked to the ground the moment that you start to realize who the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement was. But coming back to the mechanics of the whole apartheid system, you must remember we had petty apartheid, which regulated the situation inside the white areas, and Grand Apartheid, which regulated the homeland system and the independent states and these more. Those were all integrated to cause South Africa to be an economic powerhouse, where in the black areas you had huge developments there, things that were actually relevant to those areas. Industries were developed in the black areas, and in the white areas you had the migrants coming in, working there and going back to their tribal homelands, where these pass laws and things, the influx control laws also came into play.
Schalk, we're coming up to a station. Welcome back, Schalk.
Thank you, Karen.
So now we were going to talk about the dreaded pass laws and the Dompas.
Let's do that. Once again, I want to emphasize that the pass laws were not created as of 1948. The pass laws actually came as early as the 1870s under the British colonial rule in Natal, where the migrant laborers to the rest of South Africa started to be formalized into these pass laws. You must remember, as I pointed out, the black people living in the tribal areas were seen firstly as the subjects of those chieftains ruling those areas, but later on even as subjects of the crown. So the British colonial rule wanted those people to still be the subjects of the British Empire. But you had the Boer republics. So now you had the Zulu people flowing in huge numbers into the Transvaal, for instance, to go and work on the gold mines. And it was a mechanism by the British to ensure that those people remained their subjects. That in the first place created this whole system of the pass laws that later on became such maligned piece of the apartheid system. So once again, it's a British invention. It's not an Afrikaner or a Boer invention. There were quite a flow of black people into the white areas because of economics. And this is what in the first place caused it. One sometimes sit with this scenario that's created by the historians that black people in South Africa were stopped from moving around in the white areas, but it's not. The influx control and the pass laws were simply to regulate the flow of people out of the black tribal areas into the white areas where they worked in the economy.
So it was very much a passport coming from your country of Zululand into my country of the Transvaal.
Yes, that was basically it. And as I said, even in later years, because these people were seen as being the citizens of those specific tribal areas. So it's nothing strange. It's nothing malignant now to have people simply having passes. Today, if I travel to Namibia, people will require from me to have the proper documentation to do that.
Yes.
It's not strange. That it was simply how it was at that stage. But by the 1950s, there was a huge agitation regarding the whole issue of the pass laws. And that mostly came from white agitators going into the black areas and stirring up the people to come into conflict with the authorities. It was not the black population rebelling all of a sudden. You had the South African Communist Party, which was actually a white party. Yes. From 1920s that started to agitate and to activate the black population also to rebel against the Nationalist Party government. And that is where the great problem around the influx control and the dom passing and these things came from. Once again, on a personal level, I can understand a person coming from Zululand, he moves to or he migrates into the Transvaal province, he works in the mine, and now he loses his pass documents. And he's stopped by a policeman on the street, and now he's being extradited back to Zululand. I can understand that on a personal level that causes a lot of trouble. But it's part of the system. You simply have to deal with it. I can understand that it caused huge problems for a lot of people. but it's not designed to be restrictive. It's not designed to be creating slavery or whatever. It is simply there to stop the uncontrolled inflow and outflow of people into and out of a country.
But at the same time, Schalk, we had to carry an ID book.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
We had to have one as well. You couldn't get stopped at a roadblock and not produce your ID book.
Yes.
You would be in equal trouble. You wouldn't be deported because it was your country, but you would be in trouble. So it wasn't a one-way ticket, this thing. We all had to carry a form of ID. And in our ID book was our birth certificate, our marriage certificate, our driver's license, our firearm license. Our entire history was in our ID books. So it worked both ways.
Yes, for instance, let's say a white person was caught in a black tribal land by the black tribal authorities. He would have been extradited back to the white areas. It would have been a very strange thing for a white person to find himself in the first place in the black homelands.
Yes.
So you're quite right. It worked both ways. But the fact of the matter remains that you have this huge agitation all of a sudden in South Africa amongst the black population. If you go into the anti-apartheid movement and you look at the personality like Chief Albert Lutuli, who was the founding member, one of the founding members of the ANC, and one of the early leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. You see that he emphasizes non-violence. He says we must speak to the government of the day. We must try to find solutions. It must be peaceful. There mustn't be war or unnecessary disturbances and so forth. So his way is one of peace. But then you see the introduction of the SACP, the South African Communist Party, and even people coming from overseas. A person like Joe Slovo coming from Lithuania. He was a Lithuanian Jew that moved into South Africa. Bringing all these ideas of communism and Bolshevism from Europe. And that is now slowly starting to infuse into the black population and the black consciousness movement later on, which is actually foreign to what was happening in South Africa. Because in the 1930s and 40s, basically South Africa was a very peaceful society. One of the facts that people seem to not remember, during the Second World War, South Africa fought on the side of the British Empire. Now, of course, under the Afrikaners, there was huge resistance to this. The Ossewa Brandwag and the National Socialist movement of Robbie Leibrand and those guys, they were totally opposed to the war against the Germans. But South Africa as a country joined on the side of the Allies. And in the South African Defense Force, they drafted thousands upon thousands of black people who fought for the British Empire, who fought for South Africa in the Second World War.
Yes.
So in other words, those people were regarded as equal, at least then to the white men when it came to entering the war on the side of the British Empire. So it's only after the war, after the Nationalist Party takes over power, that all of a sudden you have this huge escalation in poor relations between the black and the white population. And my own opinion is that it didn't really come so much from the black populace. It was ideas, revolutionary ideas being infused into that population from Europe. And it was communist.
Yes.
You must remember that the background to the South African history was also the liberation of the whole colonial empire after the Second World War, of the French, of the Portuguese, of the British. The Americans fought the Korean War in the 1950s, and later on in the 60s and 70s you became involved in the Vietnam War, which was anti-communist. You had the communists take over in China in 1948. The communist government finally came to power there, overpowering the nationalists who fled over to Taiwan. So the whole of Southeast Asia, the whole of Central Asia, and the most part of Africa is now all of a sudden part of the Cold War that started after the Second World War. And you have this huge influx of advisors and agents from the East Bloc, from Soviet Russia, and later on from China. That's taking ideology that never before existed in Africa, and all of a sudden it becomes African.
Yes.
If you look at the liberation movements in the old Portuguese colonies, they were hardline communist, something that's totally foreign to the African way of thinking, to African society. African society is mostly built on the principle, it's called Ubuntu, which is it's peacefulness. Ne?
Yes.
But whereas the communist system is revolutionary and by its very nature, it's violent. So the idea is so-called liberating Africa in the background of the South African history is one of European and Asian communism that all of a sudden becomes in fashion in Africa. And that is also one of the reasons why the Nationalist Party, being anti-communist, is starting to devise plans and legislation to stop this inflow and this disruption into South Africa as a whole.
Yes, yes. And then began our war on our northern borders.
Yes, South Africa became actively involved in fighting communism in the southern hemisphere, in the southern part of Africa. But before we get to that, the American listener must also remember the following. Thabo Mbeki even said it when he was president many years later. South Africa has always been two nations. So you had the black nation facing its own problems, apartheid and colonialism and all these things. But the white nation itself was in turmoil and dynamics itself. The Nationalist Party came to government or came to power in 1948. The Afrikaners wanted their freedom back. In the Boer War, the Boer people lose their two Boer republics and the independence at the unification. And now, 1948, the Afrikaner government, the party was actually called the Herenigde Nasionale Partij, the Reunited Nationalist Party of the Afrikaners. Now they rule South Africa, and they have one objective, and that objective is to make South Africa free from British rule again. So you have Dr. Malan. He's the first premier of South Africa after 1948, hardline nationalist Afrikaner. He comes from the south. Then after him, you have J.G. Strydom, J.D. Strydom. He's from Transvaal. He's even more hardline Afrikaner nationalists. He comes from Nylstroom. They are hardline Boer people. So the Afrikaner people, the main focus of politics of the Afrikaner people is not about the black people. It is about gaining independence from Britain.
Yes.
And eventually, after Hendrik French Verwoerd came to power in 1961, we actually become an independent republic again through a referendum amongst the white population, where they vote yes in favor of a republic. So this is the main focus of the Afrikaner politics. The Afrikaner politics is not so much worried about the apartheid scheme and the black people up to the 1960s. It's more of liberating ourselves from British colonial rule.
Which they had been trying to do since the Brits first took over the Cape from the Dutch in the 1700s. I mean, that was kind of the beginning of the Great Trek, because they didn't like what they considered the liberal way of the British.
Yes, always.
That's
always. For 150 years, the Afrikaners were fighting against the British colonial rule. And I use Afrikaner now as a much broader term as the Boer people themselves. But that has been the vryheidsstrewe, the strive for freedom, that has always been in the Afrikaners, to be free, to rid themselves of any foreign government. You must remember, My family, the Van der Merwes, were one of the so-called Vryburger families that also didn't like the Dutch authorities. So we even rebelled against the Dutch before the British. The Afrikaner simply wants to be free. And that is the underlying pretext of the whole political scene in South Africa until about the coming of the Republic in 1961.
Yes, but it has never stopped. I mean, they all right, not the Jan van Riebeeck people. They didn't originally leave Europe because they wanted freedom. But the French Huguenots, they were fleeing religious persecution, and they wanted their freedom to worship. So even from their feet leaving Europe, never mind getting to Africa, that is what they were looking for. And to this very day, they're still looking for exactly the same thing.
That's true, Karen. You see the whole issue of self-determination. In 1983, we're skipping a little bit of history now, but in 1983, when the Conservative Party under Andries Treenicht is formed as opposition now even to the Nationalist Party, because the Nationalist Party is now reforming itself and it's looking at introducing the black vote, etc. The Conservative Party is formed, and the main emphasis of the Conservative Party is self-determination for the Afrikaner people. Skip another 20 years. Today, what drives right-wing politics in South Africa is self-determination. Now let's look at the whole system of grand apartheid. Because the Afrikaner has always strived for freedom, to govern themselves, to rule themselves. After 1948, under Malan and then Strydom, but specifically under Verwoerd, this system of self-determination is now even transplanted into the black population, where Verwoerd goes and he says, we have 10 different cultural groups in South Africa, being the Zulus, the Xhosas, the Tembu people, the Tswanas, all those, the Pedis, etc. What we are now going to do, those areas of 1913, extended in 1936, even extended further by the Native Trust Act, we're going to enlarge and bolster those areas to become separate, self-determined homelands for black people. So in other words, the strive for freedom of the Afrikaner is now also given to the black people. Now, it becomes debatable if the black people actually wanted that freedom, because apparently it agitated them. They wanted to be part of a more unified setup. But the Afrikaner, that freedom that the Afrikaner is looking for himself, that is also given to the black population in South Africa. It is not slavery. Apartheid does not equate slavery. Apartheid at that stage equated self-determination. Now we can never get back from the fact that apartheid was also economic in its flavor. And in that there was always the colored bar, and whites found themselves in more management type of positions, etc. We can never get away from that. But the main emphasis of the grand apartheid scheme of Verwoerd was to give black people freedom. And it was not only purported so. These black nations actually in the end became free. They became independent homelands where people governed themselves.
Yes.
So I can't see anything malignant in doing that. I always use the example of Basutoland and Swaziland. Now, with the unification of South Africa in 1910, those two areas were the protectorates of the British Crown, as I already indicated. So they didn't become part of the Union of South Africa. They remained protectorates. Bechuanaland, which is today Botswana, the same. They remained the protectorates of the British Crown. And those areas up to today are still independent black nations. Now, if the British can do it under the Crown, why can't the nationalist government of the Afrikaner do exactly the same? What's the difference between the two? I would argue there's none. There's none. But the one is right and the other is wrong. And I can't get my mind around that thing.
No, no, Schalk, I've battled with this forever myself. It is the total. It must have been a definite planned onslaught on the Afrikaners, because otherwise, why? Why was it acceptable all over the world? And just in this tiny little place on the southernmost tip of Africa, it was not acceptable. I still cannot get my head around it to this day.
Yes. Yeah, one can argue about conspiracies and
Yes.
anti-Afrikaner conspiracies for at least the whole program.
Yes.
Here's a very interesting thing. As from about 1958, 1959 onwards, it became very clear that the Afrikaners now, in 1948, they took the government over. As from the late 50s, it became very clear that the Afrikaners is now in their last stride in getting the total freedom, in actually now having a free republic. Now, a republic means that South Africa will have a state president. The crown is not the rulers of South Africa anymore. Ne? So, and in 1960, what happens? The so-called Sharpeville massacre.
Yes.
So on the eve of the Afrikaner establishing its republic, all of a sudden you have this huge turmoil in the black community, and it leads to these riots at Sharpeville and in Johannesburg and Langa in Cape Town.
Mm.
So why is this happening? Is it now black people trying to liberate themselves, or is it some force stopping the Afrikaners of liberating them? That's the main question we're dealing here.
Yes, absolutely, Schalk. But you know, as you say, we could go into conspiracies, we could go into the Jewish, the Jesuit, the Catholic, the Roman Church, all of them. We could go into all of them, but it won't change anything.
It won't. Just to get back to the whole anti-apartheid movement. What is always very interesting to note about the anti-apartheid movement, yes, of course, there were black people taking part of it, but the main agitators in the anti-apartheid movement were not black people, they were white people.
Yeah.
So the liberation, the drive for liberation, so-called liberation, primarily came from white ideologies, communism, liberalism. These things are foreign to Africa. It's not African systems. It's not African political thinking to behave in this way. So once again, I already spoke about this. It's these European ideologies that's infused into the African population, the black population, which causes all the trouble. I believe that we if we didn't have these communists coming into Africa and starting revolutions all over the place, we would have had a much more peaceful outcome for South Africa, where you would have a balkanization, if you want to call it that, of South Africa into a lot of nation states that would in the end have lived in harmony with one another. But that is broken up because of all these ideologies coming in.
Yes. I get that. And so those started coming in. So at what stage then, this is now when the Russian influence starts coming in, is this when the National Party started deporting people and exiling them? Because I know a lot of them actually went to Russia and were trained at the Patrice Lumumba University in Russia. So is this at this stage that starts happening?
Yes, exactly. You must remember something about the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party is anti-communist, hardline anti-communist. If you go into the roots of the early Nationalist Party, you even find that there's National Socialism, which is the ideology the farthest away from communism, being the underlying way of thinking of the Nationalist Party. So when they come to power in 1948, immediately they start to counter communism, not amongst the black people, but communism amongst the white population.
Yes.
So the biggest threat that they see is not the swart gevaar, the black danger, it's the rooi gevaar, their danger, which is the communists. Even myself, I'm not very old in the sense of nearly 100 years or whatever, but I was even infused with that anti-communist ideology of the
Yes.
Nationalist Party.
Yes.
Right, so it even went up to the 80s and even the early 90s. So the emphasis of the whole security operation in South Africa under the Nationalist Party is to counter communism coming in, and it's a real threat. It's not imagined; it's real. Southeast Asia, the Americans in the 60s are fighting the communists in Vietnam. So it's a real threat. The whole of
And we had the
Africa is
backing.
so
We had the backing
yes.
of most of the rest of the world because we were the last um, line against communism in Southern Africa anyway.
That's a fact, and that is what I'm coming to now, because the so-called liberation in Africa is done. Um, it's under the guise of liberation, but it's not really liberation. It's basically communist Russia sponsoring revolution in Africa and expelling the old colonial, the British, the French, and the Portuguese colonial masters from those areas. It's hardline communist takeovers. Frelimo in Mozambique is hardline communists. The MPLA in Angola, hardline communists. The people taking over the central, basically the whole of the central region of Africa, the old Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, those guys, their ideology is one of communism. It's not an African ideology, it's a European one being transplanted from Russia. Because we are part of the whole Cold War that's being fought between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now you must also remember that in communism there's always the rivalry, or was always the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Maoists in China. So in South Africa you had the African National Congress and the SACP being sponsored by the Russians and the PAC being sponsored by the Chinese. So you even had that rivalry also coming to South Africa. So the liberation movements in the whole of Africa and also South Africa has this communist undertone, which no nationalist government could ever tolerate. So they enact the anti-communist legislation under which Mandela, for instance, is charged. Walter Sisulu, all those guys. So it's not a white-black thing. It's an ideological thing where nationalists are fighting communists, and that is where the big struggle actually comes from. It's not a racial thing. It's a political thing.
Fit into here, Schalk?
Yes.
Where did they fit in? But what were they? Who were they?
In Inkatha, the Inkatha Freedom Party was a Zulu party.
Yes.
Yes, they were organized Zulu party, and they were at no stage resistance from the Afrikaner nationalist government towards Inkatha because they were not communist.
Okay,
so the opposition,
Zulu nationalists.
Yes, they are basically Zulu nationalists.
Okay,
yes.
Got it.
So and later on in later years they fought bloody battles in Natal, tribal battles and political battles against the communists.
Yes.
Okay. So in other words, the main fight of the nationalists is now against communism, and the security operations of the state is to stop communism. You must remember something else. Many of the apartheid era police force were actually black people. Black people patrol black areas. It's part of the apartheid system. So it's once again, I want to emphasize, it's not this racial thing. In the Bush War, many of the elite units in the Bush War in Angola are not whites.
Yeah.
They are blacks.
Yeah.
The 32 battalion is made up entirely by ex-communists that came over from the other side and being utilized now by the South African Defence Force. So it's not a white-black thing. It's a political thing.
Yeah. Okay, so now we are now finally getting rid of the British out of our lives, but now the blacks are stirred up by the Communist Party, and we have these two terrible things. We have Sharpeville and we have the Soweto riots, but misdirected because, Schalk, what I don't understand about any of that, and I don't think anybody can, is that they didn't want to be taught in Afrikaans at school. But they didn't have a written language. There were no books in their language. They didn't have words for maths and science and all of those kind of things. So take us through that.
I will do that. Let's just stop with the Sharpeville incident, because that in itself is also totally misunderstood. The narrative being built is that white security forces moved into Sharpeville and they simply massacred the 69 people.
Yes.
Once again, it's totally untrue. There were once again riots relating to the pass laws, and then a huge mob of people attacked the Sharpeville police station.
Yeah.
And in the defense of the Sharpeville police station, 69 people were killed. Now, it's a fact that after the riot started, the security forces moved in to establish peace again. But it's not this thing that's narrated of black people being mowed down in scores because of their politics. It's a defensive action that's taking place here. Exactly the same at Langa. It's a defensive thing that basically took place here, and 69 people die, which once again on a personal level is tremendous. You had the small black child being carried, a photographer taking a photo, and that goes into the world, and that is now the face of apartheid South Africa. The apartheid security forces killing black people, black children in the townships. So those things are now. It becomes part of the anti-apartheid narrative that's built up against South Africa. That's about 10 years later, 16 years later, the Soweto uprising was indeed one where the Soweto students and pupils rebelled against the use of Afrikaans. But that was not their only grievance. That was only one of their grievances. Rebelled against the use of Afrikaans in their schooling system. They didn't want to be taught in what was called the language of the oppressor.
Yes.
And they went to the streets and you saw tremendous riots. And once again, pictures of a small child being shot and carried by his brother. Now that causes the public opinion around the world to be so infused by this anti-apartheid movement and how bad and poor and evil this system is, that in the end we simply barred from all relations to the outside. We boycotted. Without the outside world really coming and seeing what's going on, we boycotted on cultural grounds, we boycotted on the sporting fields, because we have this huge anti-apartheid sentiment being driven by whites, by blacks, by everybody, seemingly a united front against it. Whilst in South Africa, the opposite is true. Most of the people are living peacefully. Most of the people seem to be happy. We have a population growth in the black townships or amongst the black population of nearly 900% in the century before liberation. We have people being educated. We have some of the best hospitals in the world. We have universities for black people, but those things are overlooked because a narrative has been built about the evil system of apartheid.
Yes. So, who? There again, it's not going to make any difference who did it. This is now, we are killing black children en masse, and it's the evil whites who are doing this. So the world turned against us, and we were left to our own devices, literally, which we managed very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a fact. The greatest economic growth in South Africa, there were two spurts of growth. The first one being around the turn of the century because of the mining, the discovery of gold and diamonds and all these things. And then under the apartheid regime, we had tremendous economic growth. We saw state enterprises like Sasol being created. Sasol, what happened was there was an oil boycott. We couldn't buy oil, crude oil from overseas. Now South Africa doesn't have natural resources of crude oil, but we have huge deposits of coal. And coal and crude oil is basically the same. One is just liquid, and the other one is the solid form of the stuff. So Sasol was created to extract the gas that was refined later on to make petrol and diesel from the coal. Technology, South African technology, that was ahead of the world at least 5 to 6 decades when Sasol was created. We created Iscor, or Iscor in the olden days. It was called Iscor. Later on, Iscor, it's now Mittal, an Indian company, took it over some years ago, which created the whole steel industry in South Africa. Because we couldn't buy steel in the rest of the world, we were being boycotted. We started Armscor, Krijgkor, which was an armaments manufacturer that created some of the most advanced weaponry on earth. Some of those weapons are not even at many years later, decades later, as not even being copied by the rest of the world. We built our own nuclear weapons. We built our own nuclear power station at Kuiberg in the Cape. So all these things are happening, and the Afrikaner government is just simply booming economically, politically, socially, culturally. The best years of the Afrikaners were under the apartheid system, because everything relating to the culture was boosted also from the government and from the state side. Unemployment was virtually eliminated amongst the white population. That was only two or three decades ago. You had the huge problem of white poverty, the arm blankes,
Yes,
in which about 30% of the population were poverty stricken. Under the apartheid rule, it was simply wiped out. Unemployment was wiped out. Everybody was employed, and they were employed in very good positions. And that, of course, started to bleed off to the black population, because the white government, the white areas were experiencing this huge, tremendous economic growth. And of course, number one, there's work and employment for black people coming in from the homelands. But secondly, there's also a huge amount of money that can be used, as we already discussed, also now to develop the black areas.
Yes. So people will counter that by saying, yes, but we complain about BBBEE today, but we had job reservation in those days. That's one of the arguments which I have been given many, many times.
Yes, but now the counter argument to the counter argument in that case, then they must give separate homelands to the white population, where they can actually live and work if they can't find work in the black areas. You must remember that primarily the black people were seen to live on the tribal areas and only came to work in South Africa. So it makes sense that you had color bars. The population that were local, that were actually living in South Africa in the white areas, they would have gone into the management tiers of business. Yes. And those coming in simply as migrants, working for a few months and going back, of course, they wouldn't have found themselves in the upper tiers of the management of businesses.
Well, they also didn't have the ability at that stage either. I mean, they still don't seem to today. But that's a story for another day. They did not have the ability to go into management. Mostly. You know, Schalk, there are always the exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, they were workers. And we didn't have enough white people to fill the labor pool.
That's a fact. That's a fact. Because you had such tremendous economic growth that you simply ran out of labor. For instance, the black population now living in the Cape Flats, close to Cape Town, those people did not live there 50 years ago or 60 years ago for that matter. They were brought in by the nationalist government to satisfy the demand for labor in Cape Town because of the economic growth there. The people living in Soweto, we already spoke about them, and most of the people living in Gauteng province today, those people only came to South Africa from the tribal areas during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and onwards, because there was this huge demand for labor. So those people came in. Here's the interesting thing about apartheid. Although politically the Afrikaners took over South Africa in 1940s, and later on the Republic came in 1960s, you still had the British companies running most of the big blue chip companies in South Africa. So you would find the Oppenheimer family, for instance, owning most of the mines, the mining interests through the Anglo-American Corporation, and taking out huge amounts of money from South Africa to London. You had the De Beers company. Now, De Beers, it sounds like it's an Afrikaner company, but it's not. It was the old company of Cecil John Rhodes. The Beers company creating the diamond cartel, the diamond monopoly in the world, and taking out huge amounts of money and even raw diamonds out of South Africa. And I can go on. So at the upper level of the economy, it's not the Afrikaner who's really benefiting from apartheid. It's actually British-owned companies that's still benefiting under the apartheid system. Yes, the middle tier, the management tier and the professional tier, that is now Afrikaners. But the top tier is still British companies taking huge profits out of South Africa because of the system of apartheid. Anglo-American at one stage was so powerful that they basically ran the Nationalist Party. It's not a conspiracy theory. There's actual written records about how much influence the Anglo-American Corporation had over South Africa and South African politics. And the now notorious Afrikaner Broederbond, how they wielded and dealt with the Anglo-American Corporation. So it's very strange that economically, and it's still today like that, economically the Afrikaner was never able to get rid of the British colonial parasite, if you want to call it, sitting on top of the whole economic pile.
Yes, but we had all these other influences, etc., but we grew, we thrived, we made money, we found ways around all the sanctions, we helped the countries around us. We helped Angola and we helped Rhodesia with all the things that were needed. Because they had severe sanctions and severe war. I remember us helping Rhodesia with just about everything that was available because they didn't have and couldn't make for themselves. So we, our small population, were not only fighting the wars externally and internally, we were helping the countries around us as well.
Yes, that's a fact. The interesting thing about what is today called Zimbabwe, and American listeners will know Zimbabwe and President Robert Mugabe and all his exploits and strange things that he is doing. Originally, it was a colony created by Cecil John Rhodes. That is where the name Rhodesia comes from. It was literally the country of Rhodes. It was his own personal domain. It was a huge chunk of land he took for himself, and he basically governed it with a corporation that he formed for many years. Later on, it became a recognized country, a colony, a separate colony, separate to South Africa under British rule. And then Ian Smith, what is called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, that was during the 1960s. He declared Rhodesia as an independent country. Now, the South African government, this is a very strange fact that people seem to remember to forget. South African government never recognized the government or the independence of Rhodesia. Never. Even under B.J. Foster, it was never recognized formally. But South Africa actually carried the whole of Rhodesia for all the years under Ian Smith's government. Financially, we invested heavily in the economy. We literally sent over food. We sent over military material. There's lots of evidence that we actually even sent troops there to go and fight them as so-called with them as so-called mercenaries in the civil war that erupted afterwards. So yes, we were carrying them. The the Portuguese colonial empire was also at that stage falling apart. Angola was so-called liberated, and Mozambique was liberated, which actually liberation meant communist takeover and then huge civil wars that raged on for decades, and we basically supported both those countries, and especially the Portuguese population in those areas. We simply took them in when they fled those areas. Why you still have today a huge Portuguese minority living in South Africa. And we fought the communists. That's the whole thing. In the latter parts of the Bush War in Angola, we were fighting Russian and East German troops, even Czechoslovak troops. We were fighting them on the ground. Cubans. Many of Fidel Castro sent thousands upon thousands of troops into Angola to come and fight the South Africans there. So we were not only building our own country. You're quite right. We were even defending democracy and freedom and Western standards and the Western way of life in the whole of the subcontinent of Africa.
Wow. Yes. So wow. You said we wouldn't get through all of this today, Schalk, and you were absolutely correct. We have about 6 minutes left. So I'd like you to finish your thoughts so that we can pick it up at another time.
I think let's sum it up once again with what I said previously. Because of poor and bad publicity that the Afrikaners and now under the apartheid system, even the system of apartheid is getting, the whole world is seeing us as a scoundrel, as a rogue state, as something strange and something that needs to be fought. But actually the opposite is true. The opposite being that Afrikaners have gained their independence. Apartheid is now created through a systematic system of laws. And we are trying to give the freedom that we have. We're trying to give that freedom also to the black tribes in South Africa. But we count that, and we count it in the first place to a certain extent by those that still cling to the British Empire. But in later years, we are now also counted by the liberation movements, and those liberation movements actually are communist infused because they are sponsored by Russia, by China, and they want their liberation is not liberation as to create freedom for people. It's simply communist revolution, and we're stopping that. Not only stopping that in South Africa, we're basically fighting it in the whole subcontinent. So apartheid as the Afrikaner is a totally misunderstood concept. Yes, of course, there's a lot of evil and bad feelings and a lot of negativity around the petty apartheid, the underbuilt in the white areas, but the grand apartheid scheme. The objective of that is simply to infuse freedom into the black tribes of South Africa.
Yes, and you know, Schalk, if you look at the magnitude of the task that was at hand then, and the different way of life and the different mores and customs and understanding of how things were done, it is easy to look back and say now, well, in hindsight, that was not such a good thing to do, but they did the best they could for their people and for the black tribes at that time. You know, we can't judge the 1940s by 2016 standards. We didn't have technology. We didn't have all of these things. So one has to cut them some slack. You know, judging by standards of today, it was probably very wicked, but they weren't living in today.
Yes, and as I said, in comparison, this is how I started the program. In comparison to what was already at that stage happening in North America, for instance, and certain places in the rest of the world, apartheid was certainly not that evil system that it's being portrayed as. Later it was actually declared a crime against humanity. That is how far they went. But if you look at segregation in the United States, that system was even more invasive and more wicked and more evil than apartheid could ever have been. For the very simple reason, the outcome of apartheid would have been freedom for the black people. Whereas the system of segregation in the southern states of the United States were the opposite. It was to keep the black population there in servitude for the rest of their lives. So that's the main difference between these two. And as I said at the start of the program, we must be very careful of taking that narrative and that experience in North America and Europe, and now all of a sudden also making it exactly the same as South Africa. I'm not a apartheid apologist. I've huge problems with the system of apartheid. Ultimately, it would have failed. But you're quite right. At that point in time, it was the best system. It was the only practical thing that the Nationalist Party could have done. And if it was done a little bit differently, and it did receive the support it could have received from the outside world, we would have sat today with what has basically happened in Europe after the fall of communism. You would have had a bunch of nation states ruling itself in total harmony and peace with one another.
Yes. We're at the end of the show. We will have Schalk back and we'll pick up where we left off. Thank you very much for listening. Same time, same place next week.
Listening to Revolution Radio.
Did you ever feel that things were not quite right? That everything was just ever so slightly askew?
Do you have, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind?
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
downloaded to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
And I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.